Romance in Santorini by Clara Winslow. Elizabeth Matthews stood on the balcony of her Santorini hotel room, the warm Aegean breeze gently tousling her chestnut hair. Below her, the narrow streets of Oyo wound their way between blue-domed churches and pastel-hued houses. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in a breathtaking array of oranges and pinks that reflected off the calm sea. As she gazed out at the postcard-perfect scene, Elizabeth felt a mix of awe and unease. This solo trip was supposed to be her great adventure, a chance to find herself after years of putting her career as a corporate lawyer first. But 3 days in, she felt more lost than ever. "Stop it," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. "You're in paradise. Enjoy it." Determined to make the most of her evening, Elizabeth grabbed her camera and headed out. She wandered the picturesque streets, capturing photos of charming doorways and cascading bougainvillea. As the last rays of sunlight faded, she found herself at a small tavern tucked away from the main tourist areas. The aroma of grilling souvlaki and the sound of lively bouzouki music drew her in. Elizabeth chose a small table in the corner, ordering a glass of local wine and a mezz platter. As she waited for her food, she flipped through the photos on her camera, a soft smile playing on her lips as she relived the moments she were captured. "Excuse me," a deep voice said, startling her from her reverie. "I couldn't help but notice your camera. Are you a professional photographer?" Elizabeth looked up to find a pair of warm brown eyes gazing at her. The man they belonged to was handsome in a rugged sort of way, with tousled dark hair and a friendly smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Oh no," Elizabeth replied, feeling a blush creep up her cheeks, "just an enthusiastic amateur." The stranger's smile widened, revealing a dimple in his left cheek. "Well, your amateur photos look pretty professional to me. I'm Nikos, by the way. Mind if I join you?" Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, her usual caution warring with a sudden desire for company. "I'm Elizabeth," she said finally, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Please sit." As Nikos settled in, Elizabeth felt a flutter of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. There was something about his easygoing demeanor that put her at ease, making her feel as though they'd known each other for far longer than a few minutes. "So, Elizabeth," Nikos said, his accent adding a charming lilt to her name, "what brings you to Santorini?" Over plates of crispy calamari and creamy tzatziki, Elizabeth found herself opening up to this kind stranger. She told him about her demanding job, the promotion she'd turned down to take this trip, and her growing sense that something was missing from her life. Nikos listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and sharing bits of his own story. He was a local, born and raised on the island, who now ran eco-friendly sailing tours. "It's a good life," he said, as he smiled. "Every day I get to share the beauty of my home with people from all over the world." As the night wore on, Elizabeth felt the weight of her worries lifting. Nikos' passion for his home was infectious, and she found herself seeing Santorini through new eyes. "You know," Nikos said as they finished their meal, "I'm taking a group out on a sunset sail tomorrow. Why don't you join us? I promise it'll be the highlight of your trip." Elizabeth bit her lip, considering. She'd planned to visit the ancient ruins of Akrotiri tomorrow, but something about Nikos made her want to throw her carefully laid plans to the wind. "You know what? I'd love to," she said, surprising herself with her enthusiasm. Nikos' answering smile was brighter than the Santorini sun. "Wonderful. Meet me at the old port at 4 p.m. and bring that camera of yours. You'll want to capture every moment." As they parted ways outside the tavern, Elizabeth felt a spark of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since arriving on the island, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The next afternoon found Elizabeth boarding Nikos' sailboat, a beautiful vessel named Eleftheri, Greek for freedom. As they set out into the sparkling Aegean, Nikos expertly guided the boat while pointing out hidden caves and secluded beaches. Elizabeth's camera clicked constantly, capturing the rugged coastline, the play of light on the water, and when he wasn't looking, Nikos himself. There was something captivating about the way he moved with such ease on the boat, the wind ruffling his hair, and a look of pure joy on his face. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, Nikos anchored in a secluded cove. The other passengers gathered at the bow of the boat for the best view, but Nikos gestured for Elizabeth to follow him to a quieter spot at the stern. "This is my favorite part," he said softly, his eyes on the horizon. "No matter how many times I see it, the sunset never fails to take my breath away." Elizabeth nodded, unable to find words to describe the beauty before her. The sky was ablaze with color, the sun a molten gold disk sinking into the sea. Without thinking, she reached out and took Nikos' hand. He turned to her, surprise and warmth mingling in his eyes. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then, gently, Nikos leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to Elizabeth's lips. It was brief, sweet, and perfect. As they parted, Elizabeth felt as though something had shifted inside her. The restlessness that had driven her to Santorini was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and possibility. "I know we've only just met," Nikos said, his voice low and earnest, "but I feel like I've been waiting for you my whole life." Elizabeth's heart soared at his words. "I know exactly what you mean," she replied. "I came to Santorini looking for myself, but I think I might have found something even better." As the last rays of sunlight faded and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Elizabeth and Nikos stood hand in hand on the gently rocking boat. The future was uncertain. Elizabeth's return ticket to New York loomed like a deadline on their newfound happiness, but in that moment, anything seemed possible. The next morning, Elizabeth woke early, her mind buzzing with excitement. She had agreed to meet Nikos for a day of exploring the island's hidden gems. As she got ready, she found herself humming a tune she'd heard at the tavern, her spirits lighter than they'd been in years. Nikos picked her up on his vintage Vespa, a spare helmet tucked under his arm. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, eyeing the scooter warily. Back home, she wouldn't have dreamed of hopping on the back of a motorcycle, let alone a scooter on winding island roads. But something about Nikos made her feel brave. "Absolutely," she said, strapping on the helmet and climbing on behind him. As they zipped along the coastal road, Elizabeth's initial trepidation gave way to exhilaration. She tightened her arms around Nikos' waist, breathing in the scent of sun-warmed skin and sea salt. The island whizzed by in a blur of whitewashed buildings and azure sea. Their first stop was a secluded black sand beach, accessible only by a steep, winding path. As they made their way down, Nikos pointed out rare wildflowers and shared legends about the island's volcanic formation. "Legend has it that Santorini was once home to the lost city of Atlantis," he said, helping Elizabeth over a particularly tricky section of the path. "Some say you can still see the ruins beneath the waves on a clear day." Elizabeth laughed, charmed by his storytelling. "And have you seen these ruins yourself?" Nikos winked. "That's for me to know and you to find out." The beach was a stark contrast to the tourist-packed shores Elizabeth had visited earlier in her trip. Here the only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves and the distant cry of seagulls. They spent the morning swimming in the crystal-clear water and lounging on the warm sand, talking about everything and nothing. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Nikos produced a picnic basket from his scooter. They feasted on local delicacies, dolmades, fresh feta, ripe figs, and a bottle of crisp white wine, as Nikos regaled Elizabeth with more island tales. "You know," Elizabeth said, leaning back on her elbows and looking out at the sea, "I've traveled all over the world for work, but I've never felt as alive as I do right here, right now." Nikos reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe that's because you're finally allowing yourself to truly experience the moment, instead of worrying about what comes next." His words hit home, and Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat. How had this man she'd known for barely 2 days managed to see right through her carefully constructed walls? After lunch, they continued their island tour, visiting a family-owned winery nestled in the hills and exploring the ruins of an ancient Minoan settlement. At each stop, Elizabeth found herself falling a little more in love, not just with Nikos, but with the island itself and the sense of freedom it represented. As the day drew to a close, Nikos brought them to a secluded cliff top overlooking the caldera. The view was breathtaking, the entire island spread out before them, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. "Elizabeth," Nikos said, turning to face her, "I know you're leaving in a few days and I know we've only just met, but I can't shake the feeling that there's something special between us. I don't want this to end when you board that plane." Elizabeth's heart raced. She'd been avoiding thinking about her departure, pushing it to the back of her mind as she lost herself in the magic of Santorini and Nikos' company. Now, faced with the reality of their situation, she felt a wave of panic. "Nikos, she began, but he gently placed a finger on her lips. "I'm not asking you to upend your entire life," he said softly. "I'm just asking for a chance to see where this could go." Elizabeth closed her eyes, her mind whirling. She thought about her life back in New York, the high-pressure job, the endless meetings, the sense of emptiness that had driven her to this trip in the first place. Then she thought about the past few days, the laughter, the adventure, the feeling of truly being alive. When she opened her eyes, Nikos was watching her, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. In that moment, Elizabeth knew what she had to do. "I can't promise you forever," she said, reaching out to take his hand. "But I can promise you now, and I can promise to try." The smile that broke across Nico's face was like the sun emerging from behind a cloud. He pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, with the beauty of Santorini spread out before them, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she was excited to find out. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of adventure and romance. Elizabeth and Nikos explored hidden coves by kayak, hiked to the island's highest point to watch the sunrise, and spent lazy afternoons wandering the winding streets of Oya, hand in hand. With each passing day, Elizabeth felt the stress and uncertainty of her old life melting away, replaced by a sense of joy and possibility she hadn't experienced since she was a child. On her last night on the island, Nikos surprised her with a private dinner on the roof of his family's tavern. Strings of fairy lights twinkled overhead, and the table was set with fine china and crystal glasses, a far cry from the casual meals they'd shared over the past week. "What's all this?" Elizabeth asked, taking in the romantic setup with wide eyes. Nikos pulled out her chair, a nervous smile playing on his lips. "I wanted our last night to be special," he said, "to give you a reason to come back." As they dined on exquisite local dishes and sipped wine under the stars, Elizabeth found herself torn. The thought of leaving Santorini, of leaving Nikos, filled her with a deep sense of loss. But at the same time, she knew she had responsibilities waiting for her back home. "Nikos," she said as they finished their decadent dessert drizzled with local honey, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Always," he said simply. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "If I went back to New York, tied up my loose ends, and came back, would you still be here? Would you still want this?" Nikos' eyes widened, a look of hope and disbelief crossing his face. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I would await a lifetime for you if that's what it took." Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes, and she laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Well, let's hope it doesn't take quite that long," she said. "I was thinking more like a month or two." Nikos stood, pulling Elizabeth to her feet and into his arms. As they swayed gently to the sound of distant bouzouki music, Elizabeth knew she was making the right choice. Santorini had given her more than just a vacation, it had given her a new perspective on life, and a chance at true happiness. The next morning, as Elizabeth boarded her flight back to New York, she felt none of the trepidation she'd expected. Instead, she was filled with a sense of purpose and excitement. She had a plan, and for once in her life, that plan wasn't about climbing the corporate ladder or meeting others' expectations. As the plane took off, Elizabeth watched the island grow smaller beneath her. But instead of feeling like she was leaving something behind, she felt like she was moving towards something wonderful. Santorini and Nikos would be waiting for her. And this time, when she returned, it wouldn't be as a lost soul searching for meaning, but as a woman ready to embrace a new adventure. Elizabeth settled back in her seat, a smile playing on her lips as she closed her eyes. In her mind, she could still hear the sound of waves lapping against Nikos' boat, could still feel the warmth of the Santorini sun on her skin. She had come to the island looking for herself, but she had found so much more. She had found love, adventure, and a future brighter than any she could have imagined. As the plane soared over the vast expanse of the Mediterranean, Elizabeth's heart soared with it. Her great adventure wasn't ending, it was just beginning, and she couldn't wait to see where it would take her next.